Hello, my amazing students. Um, Welcome to Chapter 8. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge that I submitted midterm grades this week. And overall, you all are doing really well, so I'm really proud. I know some of you are just kind of getting into the swing of things, and so for those of you who are kind of making great strides and seeing your grades improve weekly, keep going. As always, I'm cheerleading for you all and just really wanting the best for you, both in this class and in life in general. So, rah rah. Um, and thank you for continuing to be on this journey with me. So let's hop into chapter 8. If you've already done your reading, you know this is a really, really important chapter. It talks about human development, essentially, which is important, I think, for all of us to know and to understand, both in regards to our own human development, but if we're caretakers for older parents, or if we're parents of children, or if we, work with people in general, having an understanding of human development is really helpful. And so, as we know from the book, human development is the study of the changes that occur in people as they age. And we're talking about conception to death. So, really, the entire human development spectrum. As you can imagine, this topic is very rich and it is very involved, and there's a lot to it. In fact, there's a whole class on development, a developmental psychology class, because there's just so many parts to human development. As I'm sure you can all imagine. The book starts by talking a little bit about nature versus nurture. And probably most of you have at least heard of this before. It's an ongoing debate, especially within the field of psychology, kind of which of these two things, the nature or the nurture, contributes the most to who we become as humans. And so the nature part of this is really about heredity. This is the things that we inherit. This is, physical attributes, color of hair, color of eyes, genetics. This could also be diseases, propensity towards different illnesses. It also can have something to do with temperament. And so the things that we inherit are definitely a part of who we are as humans. But then there's also the nurture piece, and the nurture piece is about environmental influences. This is the things on the outside, and nature is the things that are going on the inside. Nature is the things that we don't have a lot of control over. Nurture is the things that we might. So nurture is about environmental influences, as I said. It's about our family of origin. It's about the culture that we grew up in, our religion, our neighborhood, our communities. Nurture definitely shapes who we become as humans, for better or worse. As we're kind of talking about this debate of nature versus nurture, I'd invite you to contribute your thoughts. What do you think? Do you think one is more influential than the other? As I continue to do research on this topic, I'm finding that most people agree that we are a combination of both. And one is really hard to isolate from the other because they are somewhat interdependent in different ways. But again, I'd love to hear your opinion. Um, the book goes on to start to break down a little bit the different developmental stages. And the book starts appropriately with talking about the beginning of life. And we're talking about the womb here. We're talking about conception and a baby's formation from conception. I won't go into a lot of detail, but the book talks specifically about the germinal period, the embryonic period, and the fetal period. And these are the stages of a baby's development within their mother's womb. One thing that I always think is fascinating every time I come back to this research is just how early babies begin to develop in their mother's wombs and just the things that are happening. By 8 weeks in the womb, a human baby has started to develop eyes, nose, lips, arms, legs, and a beating heart. By 8 weeks, these things are starting to happen. And that is just really fascinating to think about human development and just how intricately this process occurs. And so I just think, yeah, by 8 weeks, a baby has so many of the things that contributes to it being a human being. As you know from your reading, by 22 weeks, a forming baby can usually survive outside the womb, which means that by 22 weeks, a baby has developed most of what they need, most of what is required for life. And so, yeah, it's just really interesting to kind of think about this process. And, if you have been pregnant or gone through the process with someone who is pregnant, it's just fascinating to kind of think of what's going on within the womb and all these different milestones. Um, the book goes on to talk about Piaget. And if you've never heard of Piaget, Piaget contributed a lot to what we understand of human development, especially in regards to cognitive development. And so, really quickly, I'm just going to review the stages, Piaget stages of cognitive development. I would encourage you to spend more time on this because this is really interesting and really important. And so Piaget puts forth four main stages of cognitive development: sensory motor, which is birth to 2 years, pre operational, which is 2 to 7 years, concrete operational, which is 7 to 12 years, and formal operational, which is 12 years to adulthood. And so at each of these different stages, human beings are beginning to understand the world in different ways. They're beginning to cognitively engage in different ways. And so, yeah, spend a little bit more time with Piaget. He has some interesting things to contribute. And as far as research goes, most of his theories of development have been widely accepted. And so that is we're spending some time on. And so let's talk for a minute about attachment. This is a really vital part of our development as humans. I don't know that most people realize what a big part attachment plays in the ways that we develop from birth to adulthood. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I spent a lot of my professional growing up years at a therapeutic foster care agency, and I was working with a lot of kiddos who'd been in the system off and on for a lot of their lives, and a lot of them had a variety of cognitive and behavioral issues, in addition to emotional and relational issues. And a lot of times when we looked back in their files and just looked at their history, especially their really early formative years, we realized that they were lacking meaningful attachment figures. As you know from your reading, this kind of attachment work happens in the first 6 to 12 months of a baby's life. And so, really early on, a baby is internalizing messages about whether the world is a safe place to be or not. And the baby is internalizing these messages to use as they continue in the developmental process. And so, when a child is neglected or abused at this really young developmental stage, that has implications. In fact, a lack of secure attachment in early development can lead to adulthood issues, including an inability to form intimate relationships, difficulty in the workplace, and patterns of long-term insecurity and disconnection. And so that attachment piece is really, really vital. And so let's talk a little bit about the different attachments that are identified in the book and their implications. So we have what the book calls a secure attachment. Secure attachment is the goal. In secure attachments, babies feel safe and they feel confident that their needs will be met. This is usually mothers who are engaged and who are sensitive to their baby's needs and who meet their needs on a regular basis. Then we have avoidant attachments, and these are babies that don't feel confident that their needs will be met. And so their internalized message is that the world is not capable of meeting their needs. And usually this is unresponsive, rejecting mothers. Then we have ambivalent attachments, and this is when a baby is confused about whether their needs will be met or not. And this is usually inconsistent mothers. Mothers who have good intentions usually, but because of their own issues are incapable of being consistent in the attachment process. And then finally, we have disorganized, disoriented attachments. And this is where a baby feels unsafe most of the time. And this is usually neglectful or abusive mothers. Again, just to reiterate, these messages that are being internalized by a baby at these really young developmental stages affect all of the stages that are to come, and how a child progresses through those later stages of development. So this is really important stuff. The book goes on to talk about Erikson and his stages of development. These are largely considered the gold standard by those of us who work in the field in regards to how we measure healthy development. And so Erikson has given us 8 stages, and I think it's important to remember that successful completion of one stage is usually necessary for a healthy transition to the next. And so what we're hoping for is that each stage of development, we're being successful. So, his first stage is trust versus mistrust, and that goes back to some of the attachment work we were talking about previously. This is birth to 1 year old. This is infants who are largely dependent on adult caregivers to meet their needs. And so when their needs are met consistently, infants learn that they can trust. And alternatively, if their needs are not being met, then they learn that they can't trust. Next, we have autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is toddler age, usually 1 to 3. This is where toddlers are learning to kind of control their actions, their behaviors, and they are starting to develop a sense of independence and confidence if they can do that successfully. Or they're starting to internalize some doubt about their ability to achieve these things, and that starts some shame. Next, we have initiative versus guilt, and this is ages 3 to 5, starting preschool, elementary school. A child is starting to develop more self-control, and they're starting to get a sense of initiative to engage and to be able to do things successfully and to feel confident in that, or guilt associated with a lack of ability to initiate. Next, we have industry versus inferiority. This is elementary school ages, usually 5 to 12. And this is where a child is learning a lot of new skills, both academically but also socially. And they are either internalizing a sense of competency and excitement about that, or if they are unable to engage, they are starting to internalize a sense of failure and incompetency and inferiority to their peers who are successfully navigating this developmental stage. Next, we transition to identity versus role confusion, and this is a really significant part of the developmental process. This is usually adolescence, ages 13 to 20, sometimes into the 20s, depending on the person. But this is where we as humans are starting to cement our identity. So we're starting to get a stable sense of who we are. We're starting to develop some ego strength, some more confidence, and this is really important. Obviously, the alternative is that we have a growing insecurity, that we're unsure of where we fit. And that obviously leads to some confusion. Next, we have intimacy versus isolation, which is also a really important part of human development. This is usually early adulthood, so we're talking 20s to 30s, maybe into early 40s. And this is really where we're creating our human connections with other people. Our support systems, this is usually where we're finding our romantic partners, finding love, romance. This is where we're cementing our close friendships. Usually, the friendships that we're developing at this stage are ones that we might keep for life. And so this stage is a lot about belonging. And alternatively, if that is not happening and we can't figure out how to create those meaningful connections, there usually is an increasing sense of loneliness and disconnect. Next, we have generativity versus stagnation. This is usually middle adulthood, 40s to 50s. And this is where we're either like contributing to the world in meaningful ways, we're invested, we're leaving a legacy for the future. And so that's really important. And if that's not happening, usually we are feeling increasingly disconnected and stuck. Finally, we have ego integrity versus despair, and this is late adulthoods, usually 60s to death. And this is really where we're taking inventory of our life, and we're either content with our life and at peace, either because we've negotiated our life in a way that we're proud of, or because we've made amends for mistakes that we've made. If that doesn't happen, there's usually a sense of feeling overwhelmed with regret, and that regret leads to mounting despair. So, those are Erikson's stages, really important. Each one of them, in their own way, just contributes a lot to who we are as humans. And so, I guess my question for you is, which Erikson stage are you currently in? I'd love to have you comment and talk about how that's going for you. When you kind of look at the goals for the developmental stage that you're in, do you feel like you're being successful at meeting those goals, or do you feel like you're struggling? So let me know in the comment section. Also, the book goes on to talk in depth a little bit more about some of the stages. They spend some time on adolescence, which is a really important time for a lot of us. Again, this is ages 13 to 20s when we're doing some identity work. This is obviously the stage where we're going through puberty, which is amazing and a train wreck all at the same time. There's a lot of brain development that's happening at this time, specifically in our prefrontal cortex. You may know from your book that the prefrontal cortex is in control of impulse, decision making, processing of information. And because that is still forming in adolescence, it might explain some of our lapses as adolescents in regards to impulse control and decision making. And so that's just an interesting tidbit of information. It's also interesting to note that because so much is going on and because there is so much brain development that's still happening, adolescents can also tend to be pretty egocentric. And they do a lot of personal fables and imaginary audiences, which you can read more about in your book. But they a lot of times make up stories in their minds about people disliking them, or the opposite, them being the most popular kid in school. Um, and that can be hard to negotiate as a caretaker. So it's something to keep in mind. And it's also important that we know how to address these things appropriately, because we want to make sure that we aren't doing any damage to the ego. We certainly want to make sure that we aren't disrupting, the main goal here, which is, the developing of identity. But we also want to listen and help correct maybe some of the personal fables that are happening that are unhelpful, and getting our adolescents stuck. The book talks a little bit more about adulthood, 20s to old age, and it talks about some of the things that we can expect in that progression. Talks about our 20s being our peak physical health, peak cognitive health. That's when our senses are the sharpest. And so I think most of us know this to be true, especially if we have aged out of our 20s. So if you're in your 20s, hurrah, take full advantage, enjoy. This is your peak, people. So the 20s, that is our peak physical health, is our peak cognitive health. And hopefully it is a glorious season for most of us. As we're kind of moving into 20s and out of 20s, we do start to see some physical aging begin. Once we get into our 30s, the book tells us that we start to have some issues with vision. Our hearing starts to get a little dicey. So, into our 30s, some things are starting to happen physically. Changes are starting to happen. Once we get into our 40s, even worsening eyesight and hearing, and some gray hairs are starting to pop up. As someone who is in my 40s, I can attest to more sore knees, more mysterious backaches, more difficulty with word recall. My memory sometimes is a little bit questionable. So the wrinkles are coming on. So once we get into our 40s, our bodies are starting to decline a little bit. I think that's why, we talk about being over the hill. I think there is a little bit of truth to that. Not that we can't, do everything we can to stay in the best shape possible, to take care of ourselves, and to live life to the fullest, regardless our age. But once you get into your late 30s, early 40s, definitely you start to see some signs of decline physically and mentally. Once we get, past, 30s, 40s into middle age, usually people start to have some increasing medical issues, and our bodies start to decline more. Um, so, if you're in your 20s, live it up. If you're later on in life, live it up. Life is short. And I think, as I'm aging and I'm seeing more signs of aging, I'm just really realizing how precious life is. And just really kind of trying to make a fresh commitment to, enjoying each moment and really living connected and invested. And that's not always easy to do. So let's transition to talking about parenting for a moment. This is your discussion board topic for the week, so I look forward to reading your contributions. I would like to take one moment to say something about discussion board topics as well as video comments. Please do your reading. Um, it is obvious to me as I am reviewing your contributions whether you have read the text or not. So please do your reading. It makes your contributions much more meaningful, and it also communicates to me that you are invested in that process. So that moving right along. So parenting. So we have different parenting styles that the book talks about. I would like to review those with you. If you are a parent, this would be something to really pay attention to and take some notes on. So if you're planning to be a parent someday, might be worth tucking some notes away as well. So we have three main parenting styles. We have an authoritarian parent. This is the parent who has a lot of rules, is usually very rigid, incredibly controlling, uncompromising. Usually, authoritarian parents are the ones who use maybe excessive corporal punishment, which is spanking, or physical punishment. As we've talked about in the last chapter, that can be damaging to children. And so the authoritarian parent is not our model for parenting. Next, we have the permissive parent. And the permissive parent is usually one of two things. Usually, they're neglectful or they're indulgent, which means either they're disinterested and kind of checked out, unengaged, kind of letting the child, kind of raise themselves, or they are overly involved, spoiling, way too involved in all aspects, and not really giving their child room to kind of grow and develop on their own. And that's not to say that parents should not be actively involved in parenting, they should. But I think you understand that there is a line. And then we have authoritative parents. So if you're taking notes, I do want you to make this distinction because I've seen it confused many times and I can get it confused myself. Authoritarian is rules, rigid, controlling. Authoritative is our ideal parenting style. And authoritative parents are affectionate, they're engaged, they are affirming, but they also have healthy boundaries. And they have perfected reinforcement as a way of helping their children develop and learn right from wrong. And so, again, authoritative parenting is kind of the preferred parenting style for raising healthy, confident kiddos. Authoritarian parenting usually produces kiddos who are rebellious or have a lot of emotional and cognitive barriers that they have to overcome later in life. So, and please note that every person is different. Some of you may have had authoritarian parents. I think if you were to look at that closely, you might understand that it may have been excessive, and yet you may be very healthy, well adjusted human beings. And so each person responds to parenting in different ways. And that being said, I really advocate that we give kids the best chance for being successful, the best chance for being the most healthy, happy versions of themselves that they can be. And based on research, authoritative parenting gives us the best chance of that. Finally, I want to take a minute to talk about the stages of death and dying. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was kind of a genius in her own right. And she came up with these stages that I think are really important for consideration. Um, we also use these stages when we're talking about grief, someone who has experienced the loss of someone that they love. And so these are both stages of death and dying, but also stages of grief. So please make that note if you are taking notes. So the stages of grief are denial, and this is usually when we just don't want to believe that we are dying, and so we just kind of refuse. And next, there's some anger. There's some frustration about a sense of helplessness to change the situation, and so yeah, that's where the anger comes into play. And then usually there's some bargaining, right? We want to make deals with God or make deals with the universe. If you'll let me live, then I will commit my whole life to taking care of other people, right? This is where we're trying to use some personal sense of control to change the outcome. Um, but also, there's probably some increasing understanding that the outcome is inevitable. And once we kind of get to that place, some depression usually sets in, some sadness about the reality of our situation, the reality that our life is coming to an end, and all of the implications that go along with that. And then finally, hopefully, we make our way to acceptance. And um, acceptance doesn't ask that we be happy that our life is coming to an end, but it does kind of embrace the inevitable, so that hopefully we can die with a sense of peace. And so those are the stages of death and dying. I think they're really helpful to keep in mind when we are accompanying someone through that process, or even as we are working through our own grief. Um, so I leave you with that. And my final question for you is, what do you think was the most helpful takeaway from this chapter? What are you going to take with you that you think is really going to help you as you continue your own developmental process or help someone else through theirs? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. You have quite a few things on your plate this week in addition to doing your reading. Good luck with all of that. As always, thank you for being on this journey with me. It's such a joy. And I am just really proud to be a part of your process. And so, with that, I will say adieu, and I will talk to you again soon. All right, take care. Bye bye.